You're under arrest.
Yo, for what?
You're under arrest.
For what? I ain't doing that. Yo.
You're under arrest.
Yo, what? What? For what? For what? For what?
Resist delay obstruct.
For what?
Put your hands behind your back, sir.
What though?
Put your hands behind your back now.
For what?
Put your hands behind your back.
He didn't do nothing wrong. He ain't do nothing wrong. Yeah, for what though? What's the crime? What's the crime? What's the crime?
This gentleman is the victim. A victim of a police officer who is acting both unconstitutionally and illegally, and he is being abused by the unconstitutional and illegal conduct of a police officer. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. Reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. An objectively justifiable suspicion that is based on specific facts or circumstances that justifies a peace officer stopping a person thought to be involved in a criminal activity at the time. Another definition is a police officer possesses reasonable suspicion if he has enough knowledge to lead a reasonably cautious person to believe that criminal activity is occurring and that the individual played some part in it. The difference between having reasonable suspicion and not having it is the ability for a police officer to hold a non-consensual contact with you. In other words, you don't have the right to leave, or a consensual contact. If the officer does not have reasonable suspicion, then his contact with you on your part is voluntary. That's called a consensual contact. You can tell whenever you're talking to a police officer if it's a consensual contact or non-consensual by simply asking the question, "Officer, am I free to leave now?" If he says yes, it's consensual and you can walk away. If he says no, it's a non-consensual contact, which constitutionally requires him at that moment to have something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. Reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. We don't want things like this thug pretending to be a police officer abusing the law, because when they abuse the law, they're abusing you. The courts have held that reasonable suspicion is not based on gut instinct or a hunch. Remember, the definition was there are facts and circumstances that the officer can articulate that would lead a reasonably cautious person to assume that such is so. It's also important to understand that police officers do not function on any personal authority. The only authority they have is that authority established in law. In law. The only authority they have is that authority established in law. Not what they might want to have. They want to seize extra authority at that moment because, well, they're in a mood to do that. The law doesn't permit that. Their job description doesn't permit that. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. The police officer simply not liking that he can't have his way, even though the law doesn't support him having his way, acting as if he had reasonable suspicion when in fact he did not. And suddenly, out of the blue, the officer says, "You're under arrest." Placing somebody under arrest requires a higher standard of information, a higher standard of facts than does reasonable suspicion. He didn't have enough facts for reasonable suspicion. How in God's name did he get to enough facts for probable cause? The law defines probable cause as apparent facts discovered through logical inquiry that would lead a reasonably intelligent and prudent person to believe that an accused person has committed a crime, thereby warranting his or her prosecution. About 95% of the police officers out there manufacture reasonable cause, a reasonable suspicion after the fact. That's why it's important to get it on the record. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. Reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. When a police officer is acting without reasonable suspicion, without probable cause, and lays his hands on somebody, he is laying his hands on them as a private citizen because the police officer only has the authority vested in him by law. Once he steps outside the law and he's no longer acting within the authority granted to him by the law, he is not technically acting as a police officer anymore. The officer acted with no reasonable suspicion. He then leaped beyond reasonable suspicion to probable cause that he did not have. His fragile ego was bent out of shape. His fragile ego was bent out of shape. I will tell you my personal feelings. Once the officer had the victim down on the ground, I would love if a bystander had asked the camera person, please turn off the camera, stop videotaping, and then kicked the officer's head clean off of his shoulders. That's what that officer deserves. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. If you say to a police officer, am I free to go now? That will tell you whether the officer has established that this is a consensual or non-consensual contact. Non-consensual contact means you have been legally detained, you are not free to go. He must have reasonable suspicion to create a non-consensual detainment, or he is in violation of the law. Reasonable suspicion is something that police officers oftentimes manufacture after the fact. That's why it's important to ask them, if you say, am I free to go now? And they say no, say, okay, great. May I have your reasonable suspicion, please? And get it on the record right then. No good cop manufactures reasonable suspicion after the fact. Good cops have reasonable suspicion to begin with, or they wouldn't be detaining you. Make sure that your constitutional protections remain in place when you're in contact with a police officer. Something called reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion. Reasonable
Articulable.
suspicion.
Articulable.
I hope this helps protect your constitutional rights in the future. I would love if a bystander had asked the camera person, please turn off the camera, stop videotaping, and then kicked the officer's head clean off of his shoulders. And then kicked the officer's head clean off of his shoulders.